Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last session of the guided reading of Sense and Sensibility. It's been 13 sessions so far. So, what is it? More than 3 months. And it's been a great journey to explore the works of Jane Austen, specifically Sense and Sensibility. So, to dig deeper into the language that the author uses, the changes in characterization, points of view, narrative style, irony, sarcasm. Jane Austen's literary work is so rich. So you see, we've spent more than 3 months just talking about and reading, of course, one single book, and there's so much more to explore. And that is why I tell you that if this is something that you're interested in and that's something you're passionate about, that you should continue studying. It's such a magical world, the world of literature. And as you know, I'm passionate about 19th century English literature. Um, and it's a magical world. So I try to share this passion of mine with you here. But of course, we can only go to a certain extent. So I would like to tell you that if you would like to continue your journey with Jane Austen, you should sign up for the online course, the Jane Austen Club, that I have created with a lot of love and dedication for you. It is 4 modules, 13 lessons, if I'm not mistaken. And it is a journey through English literature, English history, social history, cultural history, the books written by Jane Austen. It's also a journey through her life. And I'm very happy that I created that course. And let me tell you right now so I don't forget. Stay with me until the end of this session because I have something for you, Jane Austen lover. Okay? So today we're going to finish reading Sense and Sensibility, and let me know how you feel about it. So I would like to know two things from you. What are your thoughts on Sense and Sensibility after all this journey? And how was your experience reading the text along with me? So I would love to know that, and also to plan um, future projects. Jenny says that she's looking forward to this session, but said it's the last one. Yes, but it's the last one for now, right? There's much more to come. I know Jenny's part of the course, the Jane Austen Club, so you can continue exploring the fantastic world of Jane Austen there. Michelle is also here. Nice to see you. So excited and also sad that this is our last session, going through all of the emotions right now. Yes, because that's why I don't like to read in a rush, right? And you see, I prefer quality over quantity. So I'm not that's something I also talk about in the Creative Reader Academy. I don't believe in reading for the sake of numbers. So, I read 100 books a year, I read 150 books a year. And then, how meaningful were these reading experiences? So, quantity is not important. What is important is relevance, significance, and quality. For instance, it took us over 3 months to read Sense and Sensibility, but we've really enjoyed it and we've really engaged with it. And then you spend time with these characters, so 3 months, and you get to know them, and then it feels really hard to say goodbye, right? And that's a good sign. It means it's been a relevant experience. And I'm glad that, well, I'm not glad that you're sad, but it means it's been a relevant, meaningful experience. I'll say it one more time. It's Jane Austen o'clock at Books and Culture, and I have my cup of tea here. Do you have your cup of tea or cup of coffee? Your copy of Sense and Sensibility, and today we'll read chapters 46 to 50, or um, chapters 10 to 14 in volume 3, if that's how your edition is divided. But before we do that, let's take a step back and revise what we talked about last time. So, last time, Marianne and Eleanor left London to Cleveland with Mrs. Jennings, and Marianne suffers to leave London behind because although she was wretched there the whole time, but that is the place where she last held hopes for a future with Willoughby. So at the same time that she's saying goodbye to London, the place, she's saying goodbye to this dream of living, of spending a lifetime with Willoughby. So that is painful. Eleanor, on the other hand, is happy to leave. She wants to leave behind all this Edward Ferrars, Lucy Steele drama. And the trip takes 3 days. Remember, it was very hard to move from one place to another back then. And they're traveling with Charlotte Palmer, who's just had a baby. So they're taking it slowly, they're taking it easy. So it takes them 3 days to arrive in Cleveland. And as they arrive there, Marianne is happy that she can enjoy contact with nature again. So she leaves the urban center of London behind. And so the world of social activities, of indoors activities, and she's able to breathe the countryside air again. And she feels great. And she goes on solitary rambles in nature, just thinking, right? She likes to do that, thinking about Combe Magna now that she's relatively close. But the weather is not great. It rains a lot, and because of the heavy rain and her twilight walks, very romantic and picturesque, she catches a cold, terrible cold, and is feverish. At the beginning, it seems like it's just a cold. Eleanor doesn't take it seriously. Even Marianne doesn't take it seriously. She thinks, well, just a good night of sleep will revive me. But that is not the case. She gets really, really ill. And she has feverish hallucinations. And it leads to Mrs. Jennings and even Eleanor fearing the worst. So Eleanor is shocked that she let it go for so long without realizing the danger that her sister's in. So she calls her mother, right? But remember, it will be difficult to bring her mother there. So Colonel Brandon saves the day, the hero. He volunteers to go fetch Mrs. Dashwood in person in Barton. So he has the means for that. And they come. He comes back and brings her. And mother and daughter are reunited. It's a very beautiful moment. And after days of intense fever and fatigue, Eleanor finally sees signs of recovery in Marianne and dares to be hopeful again. And oh yes, before Mrs. Dashwood arrives, something very important happens. It's a stormy night, very gothic, grotesque. And there's the sound of a carriage, and Eleanor thinks it's Colonel Brandon and her mother arriving. But Eleanor is extremely surprised to see Mr. Willoughby. Mr. Willoughby has, like a phoenix, come back from the ashes. And it is a long chapter that we read last time, but very interesting, in which Willoughby explains himself and gives an apology to Eleanor. He admits that at first he only wanted to amuse himself with Marianne, but that he really fell in love with her. So, yes, he began as a trickster, let's say a player, but eventually his feelings for Marianne were true. Um, However, his love for her could not outweigh his dread of poverty. And he admits being vain and selfish. So love is not enough for him if that means that he will have a poor life. He is extravagant. He lives an expensive life. So he thinks, expensive comforts. So for that reason, he chooses to marry Miss Grey, who is not the woman he loves, but the woman that will afford this kind of lifestyle. But now he's very unfortunate in his marriage. He cannot help but compare, Marianne and Miss Grey. Sophie, I think, was her name, right? Um, and then Mrs. Dashwood and Colonel Brandon arrive. Mother and daughter are reunited in a very beautiful scene. Mrs. Dashwood is extremely happy and relieved to see Marianne recovering. And Mrs. Dashwood tells Eleanor that Colonel Brandon confessed his constant love for Marianne during their trip there from Barton. So they were both so preoccupied, not very uncertain whether Marianne would even live or die. And at that moment, Colonel Brandon just poured forth his heart and confessed that he had felt this constant love, different from Willoughby, that was a peak, you know. Um, Colonel Brandon's love for Marianne has been constant. And Mrs. Dashwood is confident that Marianne would be very happy with him. And we'll see how this story plays out. So today we're going to read 5 chapters. 5 chapters, although one of them is pretty short. So then we can make it to the end. And there are very interesting discussions. So let's start with chapter 46 or chapter 10 in volume 3. Marianne's illness, though weakening in its kind, had not been long enough to make her recovery slow. And with youth, natural strength, and her mother's presence in aid, it proceeded so smoothly as to enable her to remove within 4 days after the arrival of the letter into Mrs. Palmer's dressing room. When there, at her own particular request, for she was impatient to pour forth her thanks to him for fetching her mother, Colonel Brandon was invited to visit her. For the first time, Marianne is happy to see Colonel Brandon. And why? Because of what he has done for her to bring her mother close to her in this moment of illness. So that's something she will never forget, something she's very grateful for. His emotion in entering the room, in seeing her altered looks, and in receiving the pale hand which she immediately held out to him, was such as in Eleanor's conjecture must arise from something more than his affection for Marianne, or the consciousness of its being known to others. And she soon discovered in his melancholy eye and varying complexion, as he looked at her sister, the probable recurrence of many past scenes of misery to his mind, brought back by that resemblance between Marianne and Eliza already acknowledged, and now strengthened by the hollow eye, the sickly skin, the posture of reclining weakness, and the warm acknowledgment of peculiar obligation. Mrs. Dashwood, not less watchful of what passed than her daughter, but with a mind very differently influenced, and therefore watching to very different effect, saw nothing in the colonel's behavior but what arose from the most simple and self-evident sensations, while in the actions and words of Marianne she persuaded herself to think that something more than gratitude already dawned. At the end of another day or two, Marianne growing visibly stronger every 12 hours, Mrs. Dashwood, urged equally by her own and her daughter's wishes, began to talk of removing to Barton. On her measures depended those of her 2 friends. Mrs. Jennings could not quit Cleveland during the Dashwood stay, and Colonel Brandon was soon brought, by their united request, to consider his own abode there as equally determinate, if not equally indispensable. At his and Mrs. Jennings' united request in return, Mrs. Dashwood was prevailed on to accept the use of his carriage on her journey back, for the better accommodation of her sick child. And the colonel, at the joint invitation of Mrs. Dashwood and Mrs. Jennings, whose active good nature made her friendly and hospitable for other people as well as herself, engaged with pleasure to redeem it by a visit at the cottage in the course of a few weeks. So they're going back to Barton, and Mrs. Dashwood has accepted Colonel Brandon's offer, and decided to use his carriage to go back to Barton in a more comfortable manner, especially because Marianne is still recovering. The day of separation and departure arrived, and Marianne, after taking so particular and lengthened a leave of Mrs. Jennings, one so earnestly grateful, so full of respect and kind wishes, as seemed due to her own heart from a secret acknowledgment of past inattention, and bidding Colonel Brandon farewell with the cordiality of a friend, was carefully assisted by him into the carriage, of which he seemed anxious that she should engross at least half. See how Marianne is changing. She's already changed. So she realizes how disrespectful and unkind she has been to Mrs. Jennings, who took the girls to London, sheltered them in her home, gave them the best of food, tried to entertain them, to bring them to the best social activities in London, took care of her when she was ill. So Marianne finally realizes how, yes, how disrespectful she had been and how unkind, ungenerous she had been to Mrs. Jennings. And also to Colonel Brandon. Remember how childish she used to be. She used to leave every time he arrived and would complain, what is he doing here? What can he mean? And why is he here all the time? And now she's changed. She sees the world and people differently now. Mrs. Dashwood and Eleanor then followed, and the others were left by themselves to talk of the travellers and feel their own dullness, till Mrs. Jennings was summoned to her chaise to take comfort in the gossip of her maid for the loss of her two young companions, and Colonel Brandon immediately afterwards took his solitary way to Delaford. The Dashwoods were 2 days on the road, and Marianne bore her journey on both, without essential fatigue. Everything that the most zealous affection, the most solicitous care could do to render her comfortable was the office of each watchful companion, and each found their reward in her bodily ease and her calmness of spirit. To Eleanor, the observation of the letter was particularly grateful. She, who had seen her week after week so constantly suffering, oppressed by anguish of heart which she had neither courage to speak of nor fortitude to conceal, now saw with a joy which no other could equally share, an apparent composure of mind, which, in being the result, as she trusted, of serious reflection, must eventually lead her to contentment and cheerfulness. This is being used to describe Marianne's behavior: composure of mind and serious reflection. So, in a way, she's adopting some of Eleanor's characteristics, the sense of Eleanor. And that is how we see Marianne's character developing and maturing, right? As they approached Barton, indeed, and entered on scenes of which every field and every tree brought some peculiar, some painful recollection, she grew silent and thoughtful, and turning away her face from their notice, sat earnestly gazing through the window. But here Eleanor could neither wonder nor blame, and when she saw, as she assisted Marianne from the carriage, that she had been crying, she saw only an emotion too natural in itself to raise anything less tender than pity, and in its unobtrusiveness entitled to praise. In the whole of her subsequent manner, she traced the direction of a mind awakened to reasonable exertion, for no sooner had they entered their common sitting room Then Marianne turned her eyes around it with a look of resolute firmness, as if determined at once to accustom herself to the sight of every object which the remembrance of Willoughby could be connected. Again, the use of that word exertion. So that's a very topical word when we think about late 18th century, here also beginning of the 19th, still vestiges of this idea of exertion, meaning using the faculties of the brain, using rationality to master the passions of the body. So remember, Marianne was all about pouring forth her emotions. She had no moderation. She even felt joy in exaggerated feelings of emotion, either positive or negative. But now she does not make a show of her emotions. She cries unobtrusively, as Eleanor puts it, and that is entitled to praise. So her mind is awakened to reasonable exertion. So these words are very important. And now she's back. They're back in Barton, and of course, some things are still painful because a lot of the memories from Barton Cottage are intertwined with memories of Willoughby. So she has to come to terms and accept those memories and just set them aside. She said little, but every sentence aimed at cheerfulness, and though a sigh sometimes escaped her, it never passed away without the atonement of a smile. After dinner, she would try her pianoforte. She went to it, but the music on which her eye first rested was an opera procured for her by Willoughby, containing some of their favorite duets and bearing on its outward leaf her own name in his handwriting. That would not do. She shook her head, put the music aside, and after running over the keys for a minute, complained of feebleness in her fingers, and closed the instrument again, declaring, however, with firmness as she did so, that she should in future practice much. So if now she's overcome by feelings, takes time. Of course, you cannot just turn off emotions, right? She's learning exertion. She's learning how to control her emotions. So if this is a bit overwhelming at the moment, she stops, but she says, with the promise that she should in future practice much. The next morning produced no abatement in these happy symptoms. On the contrary, with a mind and body alike strengthened by rest, she looked and spoke with more genuine spirit, anticipating the pleasure of Margaret's return, and talking of the dear family party which would then be restored, of their mutual pursuits and cheerful society as the only happiness worth a wish. When the weather is settled and I have recovered my strength, said she, we will take long walks together every day. We will walk to the farm at the edge of the down and see how the children go on. We will walk to Sir John's new plantations at Barton Cross and the Abbey land, and we will often go to the old ruins of the Priory and try to trace its foundations as far as we are told they once reached. I know we shall be happy. I know the summer will pass happily away. I mean never to be later in rising than 6, and from that time till dinner I shall divide every moment between music and reading. I have formed my plan and am determined to enter on a course of serious study. Our own library is too well known to me to be resorted to for anything beyond mere amusement. But there are many books well worth reading at the park, and there are others of more modern production which I know I can borrow of Colonel Brandon. By reading only 6 hours a day, I shall gain in the course of a 12-month a great deal of instruction which I now feel myself to want. So she has a plan. She's going to keep herself busy. Remember, that was also Eleanor's way of grieving when Edward first left. So she became very active, and that's Marianne's plan. She's going to wake up no later than 6, and from that time until dinner time, she would fill the day with activities, reading, music, etc. And she's determined to enter on a course of serious study. Eleanor honored her for a plan which originated so nobly as this, though smiling to see the same eager fancy which had been leading her to the extreme of languid indolence and selfish repining, now at work in introducing excess into a scheme of such rational employment and virtuous self control. So Eleanor smiles. She's happy that Marianne is thinking of such a noble plan, but at the same time, she sees that this is just another type of extreme. So now she's not indulging herself in emotions, but an excess of rational employment and virtuous self control. And remember, no extreme is advantageous. So Marianne will have to find something in between. She's still lost, she's finding her way. Her smile, however, changed to a sigh when she remembered that her promise to Willoughby was yet unfulfilled, and feared she had that to communicate which might again unsettle the mind of Marianne, and ruin at least for a time this fair prospect of busy tranquillity. Willing therefore to delay the evil hour, she resolved to wait till her sister's health were more secure before she appointed it. But the resolution was made only to be broken. Eleanor remembered that she made a promise to Willoughby that she would tell Marianne about their conversation, his explanations, and his apology, but she's waiting for the right moment when Marianne feels completely recovered. Marianne had been 2 or 3 days at home before the weather was fine enough for an invalid like herself to venture out. But at last a soft, genial morning appeared, such as might tempt the daughter's wishes and the mother's confidence, and Marianne, leaning on Eleanor's arm, was authorized to walk as long as she could without fatigue in the lane before the house. She's finally allowed to go outside, but only in the lane before the house, taking it easy. The sisters set out at a pace slow as the feebleness of Marianne in an exercise hitherto untried since her illness required, and they had advanced only so far beyond the house as to admit a full view of the hill, the important hill behind, when pausing with her eyes turned towards it, Marianne calmly said, "There, exactly there," pointing with one hand, "on that projecting mound. There I fell, and there I first saw Willoughby." Her voice sunk with the word, but presently reviving, she added, "I am thankful to find that I can look with so little pain on the spot. Shall we ever talk on that subject, Eleanor?" Hesitatingly, it was said. "Or will it be wrong? I can talk of it now, I hope, as I ought to do." Eleanor tenderly invited her to be open. "As for regret," said Marianne, "I have done with that, as far as he is concerned. I do not mean to talk to you of what my feelings have been for him, but what they are now. At present, if I could be satisfied on one point, if I could be allowed to think that he was not always acting a part, not always deceiving me, but above all, if I could be assured that he never was so very wicked as my fears have sometimes fancied him since the story of that unfortunate girl." She stopped. Eleanor joyfully treasured her words as she answered, "If you could be assured of that, you think you should be easy." "Yes, my peace of mind is doubly involved in it, for not only is it horrible to suspect a person who has been what he has been to me of such designs, but what must it make me appear to myself? What in a situation like mine but a most shamefully unguarded affection could expose me to?" "How then," asked her sister, "would you account for his behavior?" "I would suppose him, oh, how gladly would I suppose him only fickle, very, very fickle." Eleanor said no more. She was debating within herself on the eligibility of beginning her story directly or postponing it till Marianne were in stronger health, and they crept on for a few minutes in silence. I am not wishing him too much good, said Marianne at last with a sigh, when I wish his secret reflections may be no more unpleasant than my own. He will suffer enough in them. Do you compare your conduct with his? No, I compare it with what it ought to have been. I compare it with yours. Our situations have borne little resemblance. They have borne more than our conduct. Do not, my dearest Eleanor, let your kindness defend what I know your judgment must censure. My illness has made me think. It has given me leisure and calmness for serious recollection. Long before I was enough recovered to talk, I was perfectly able to reflect. I considered the past. I saw in my own behavior since the beginning of our acquaintance with him last autumn nothing but a series of imprudence towards myself and want of kindness to others. I saw that my own feelings had prepared my sufferings, and that my want of fortitude under them had almost led me to the grave. My illness, I well knew, had been entirely brought on by myself, by such negligence of my own health, as I had felt even at the time to be wrong. Had I died, it would have been self destruction. I did not know my danger till the danger was removed, but with such feelings as these reflections gave me, I wonder at my recovery. Wonder that the very eagerness of my desire to live, to have time for atonement to my God, and to you all, did not kill me at once. Had I died, in what peculiar misery should I have left you, my nurse, my friend, my sister? You, who had seen all the fretful selfishness of my latter days, who had known all the murmurings of my heart, how should I have lived in your remembrance? My mother, too, how could you have consoled her? I cannot express my own abhorrence of myself. Whenever I looked towards the past, I saw some duty neglected or some failings indulged. Everybody seemed injured by me. The kindness, the unceasing kindness of Mrs. Jennings, I had repaid with ungrateful contempt. To the Middletons, the Palmers, the Steeles, so to every common acquaintance even, I had been insolent and unjust, with a heart hardened against their merits and a temper irritated by their very attention. To John, to Fanny, yes, even to them, little as they deserve, I had given less than their due. But you above all, above my mother, had been wronged by me. I, and only I, knew your heart and its sorrows. Yet to what did it influence me? Not to any compassion that could benefit you or myself. Your example was before me, but to what avail? Was I more considerate of you and your comfort? Did I imitate your forbearance or lessen your restraints by taking any part in those offices of general complaisance or particular gratitude which you had hitherto been left to discharge alone? No, not less when I knew you to be unhappy than when I had believed you at ease. Did I turn away from every exertion of duty or friendship, scarcely allowing sorrow to exist but with me, regretting only that heart which had deserted and wronged me, and leaving you, for whom I professed an unbounded affection, to be miserable for my sake? Now, this is such an important step in Marianne's journey, and it is a very beautiful long paragraph. The illness has made her think. It has given her time to reflect about her own conduct to herself and to others. And she realizes the wrongs in her conduct, how she has treated others unkindly, um, repaid kindness with ungrateful contempt. To Mrs. Jennings, to the Middletons, the Palmers, the Steeles, even to John and Fanny Dashwood. She did not do what was required of her. Um, but above all, she feels sorry for how she has behaved towards Eleanor. Marianne had been so selfish in her own grief, in her own misery, thinking that she was the only person in the world suffering, the only suffering that mattered, that was heavy enough that she completely neglected Eleanor's suffering and Eleanor's need of companionship, of comfort, of consolation. So she realizes she failed Eleanor. Eleanor needed her, and she was not there for her when Eleanor was there for Marianne all the time. Here sees the rapid flow of her self reproving spirit, and Eleanor, impatient to soothe, though too honest to flatter, gave her instantly that praise and support which her frankness and her contrition so well deserved. Marianne pressed her hand and replied, "You are very good. The future must be my proof. I have laid down my plan, and if I am capable of adhering to it, my feelings shall be governed and my temper improved." Let's see Marianne's plan. "They shall no longer worry others, nor torture myself. I shall now live solely for my family. You, my mother and Margaret, must henceforth be all the world to me. You will share my affections entirely between you. From you, from my home, I shall never again have the smallest incitement to move. And if I do mix in other society, it will be only to show that my spirit is humbled, my heart amended, and that I can practice the civilities, the lesser duties of life with gentleness and forbearance. As for Willoughby, to say that I shall soon or that I shall ever forget him would be idle. His remembrance can be overcome by no change of circumstances or opinions, but it shall be regulated, it shall be checked by religion, by reason, by constant employment. So that's her plan. Using reason, religion, and constant employment, she will dedicate her life, herself, all her hours to her family, meaning her mother and her sisters, and to her home. And she will not move. That's her plan. A very extreme plan, right? She paused and added in a lower voice, "If I could but know his heart, everything would become easy." Eleanor, who had now been for some time reflecting on the propriety or impropriety of speedily hazarding her narration, without feeling at all nearer decision than at first, heard this, and perceiving that as reflection did nothing, resolution must do all, soon found herself leading to the fact. She managed the recital as she hoped with address. So she tells Marianne about Willoughby's apology. Prepared her anxious listener with caution, related simply and honestly the chief points on which Willoughby grounded his apology, the justice to his repentance, and softened only his protestations of present regard. Marianne said not a word. She trembled. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, and her lips became whiter than even sickness had left them. A thousand inquiries sprung up from her heart, but she dared not urge one. She caught every syllable with panting eagerness. Her hand, unknowingly to herself, closely pressed her sister's, and tears covered her cheeks. Eleanor, dreading her being tired, led her towards home until they reached the door of the cottage, easily conjecturing what her curiosity must be, though no question was suffered to speak it, talked of nothing but Willoughby and their conversation together, and was carefully minute in every particular of speech and look, where minuteness could be safely indulged. As soon as they entered the house, Marianne, with a kiss of gratitude, and these two words just articulate through her tears, "Tell mamma," withdrew from her sister and walked slowly upstairs. Eleanor would not attempt to disturb a solitude so reasonable as what she now sought, and with a mind anxiously prearranging its result, and a resolution of reviving the subject again, should Marianne fail to do it, she turned into the parlor to fulfill her parting injunction. And that is the end of chapter 10, volume 3, or chapter 46. So tell me, how do you feel about Marianne's journey and her new plan and her change, her after she had time to reflect about her own conduct towards herself and to others during her illness? It shows character development, but still, she's going from one extreme to another. From indulging herself with everything, all that is pleasurable, feelings, um, regarding no social conventions, completely free. Now she moves to the other opposite, which is regulated by extreme rules, religion, exertion. Um, what was the other things that she wanted to? Religion, reason, and constant employment. She would dedicate her time only to her family and to her house and nothing more. Jenny says she has learned how to control her emotions, but yes, gone from one extreme to another. Yes, so she really wants to change, which is honorable. She has learned from the past how she has suffered. She doesn't want to go through that again, but she's moving to another extreme. She needs to still find her balance. Miche says, I think her observations of her behavior are correct and her heart is in the right place, but she's still acting out of emotion into the next extreme. Yes, she is acting with emotion to avoid emotion, indeed. So that leads her to this other side of the other pole of the spectrum. Um, so in this chapter, we talked about how Marianne recovers. She thanks Mrs. Jennings and Colonel Brandon. She changes, Marianne changes. She feels sorry for the way she has acted towards others, especially Eleanor. And she also realizes the wrongs in her past conduct. To herself, remember, she said, if I had died, it would have been of self destruction. But now she wants to live, and she wants to live a different life. The illness has made her think and change. She wants to keep her body and mind occupied. And as they're back in Barton, and Eleanor tells Marianne of Willoughby's explanations and apology. And she feels better after learning this, learning that Willoughby was not deceiving her all the time, that his feelings for her were actually genuine. And now Marianne asks Eleanor to tell their mother. And that's what's happening in chapter 47. Let's take a look. Mrs. Dashwood did not hear unmoved the vindication of her former favorite, meaning Willoughby was her former favorite. She rejoiced in his being cleared from some part of his imputed guilt. She was sorry for him, she wished him happy, but the feelings of the past could not be recalled. Nothing could restore him with a faith unbroken, a character unblemished, to Marianne. Nothing could do away the knowledge of what the latter had suffered through his means, nor remove the guilt of his conduct towards Eliza. Nothing could replace him, therefore, in her former esteem, nor endure the interests of Colonel Brandon. Had Mrs. Dashwood, like her daughter, heard Willoughby's story from himself, had she witnessed his distress and been under the influence of his countenance and his manner, it is probable that her compassion would have been greater. But it was neither in Eleanor's power nor in her wish to rouse such feelings in another by her retailed explanation as had at first been called forth in herself. Reflection had given calmness to her judgment and sobered her own opinion of Willoughby's deserts. She wished, therefore, to declare only the simple truth and lay open such facts as were really due to his character, without any embellishment of tenderness to lead the fancy astray. She doesn't want to add more fire, more wood to this fire, right? She will only say what is necessary. And yes, the way Willoughby talked to her was very moving, and it would have affected Mrs. Dashwood and Marianne deeply. So it's good that he was heard by Eleanor, because reflection had given calmness to her judgment and sobered her own opinion of Willoughby. So she will only pass on the information that is necessary, without any embellishment of tenderness to lead the fancy astray. They've had troubles with him as it is, enough as it is. In the evening, when they were all three together, Marianne began voluntarily to speak of him again, but that it was not without an effort. The restless, unquiet thoughtfulness in which she had been for some time previously sitting, her rising color as she spoke, and her unsteady voice plainly showed. I wish to assure you both, said she, that I see everything as you can desire me to do. Mrs. Dashwood would have interrupted her instantly with soothing tenderness, had not Eleanor, who really wished to hear her sister's unbiased opinion, by an eager sign, engaged her silence. Marianne slowly continued. It is a great relief to me, what Eleanor told me this morning. I have now heard exactly what I wished to hear. For some moments her voice was lost, but recovering herself, she added, and with greater calmness than before, I am now perfectly satisfied. I wish for no change. I never could have been happy with him after knowing, as sooner or later I must have known, all this. I should have had no confidence, no esteem. Nothing could have done it away to my feelings. I know it, I know it, cried her mother, happy with a man of libertine practices, with one who had so injured the peace of the dearest of our friends and the best of men. No, my Marianne has not a heart to be made happy with such a man. Her conscience, her sensitive conscience, would have felt all that the conscience of her husband ought to have felt. Marianne sighed and repeated, I wish for no change. You consider the matter, said Eleanor, exactly as a good mind and a sound understanding must consider it. And I dare say you perceive, as well as myself, not only in this but in many other circumstances, reason enough to be convinced that your marriage must have involved you in many certain troubles and disappointments, in which you would have been poorly supported by an affection on his side much less certain. Had you married, you must have been always poor. His expensiveness is acknowledged even by himself, and his whole conduct declares that self denial is a word hardly understood by him. His demands and your inexperience together on a small, very small income must have brought on distress which would not be the less grievous to you from having been entirely unknown and unthought of before. Your sense of honor and honesty would have led you, I know, when aware of your situation, to attempt all the economy that would appear to you possible. And perhaps as long as your frugality retrenched only on your own comfort, you might have been suffered to practice it. But beyond that, and how little could the utmost of your single management do to stop the ruin which had begun before your marriage? Beyond that, had you endeavored, however reasonably, to abridge his enjoyments, is it not to be feared that instead of prevailing on feelings so selfish to consent to it, you would have lessened your own influence on his heart and made him regret the connection which had involved him in such difficulties? So now Eleanor is rationalizing, being very practical. You know what? Now that you think about it, you should be relieved that you did not marry Willoughby, because your life would be a life of difficulties. Um, Especially, they would be poor. They would not have enough money to afford such an expensive life that Willoughby deems necessary and comfortable. So that would cause problems, and it would lead to um, problems between them, to arguments between them, right? And maybe lead Willoughby to regret his connection with Marianne. Marianne's lips quivered, and she repeated the word selfish in a tone that implied, do you really think him selfish? The whole of his behavior, replied Eleanor, from the beginning to the end of the affair, has been grounded on selfishness. It was selfishness which first made him sport with your affections, which afterwards, when his own were engaged, made him delay the confession of it, and which finally carried him from Barton. His own enjoyment or his own ease was in every particular his ruling principle. It is very true. My happiness never was his object. Yes, and Marianne is right here. She understands Eleanor. Willoughby was always concerned with his own happiness, with his own life and comfort and lifestyle. So he was selfish. He is a selfish and vain man, as he knows. He knows. And Marianne finally understands that her happiness was never his object. At present, continued Eleanor, he regrets what he has done. And why does he regret it? Because he finds it has not answered towards himself. It has not made him happy. His circumstances are now unembarrassed. He suffers from no evil of that kind, and he thinks only that he has married a woman of a less amiable temper than yourself. But does it thence follow that had he married you, he would have been happy? The inconveniences would have been different. He would then have suffered under the pecuniary distresses which, because they are removed, he now reckons as nothing. He would have had a wife of those whose temper of he would have had a wife of whose temper he could make no complaint, but he would have been always necessitous, always poor, and probably would soon have learned to rank the innumerable comforts of a clear state and good income as of far more importance even to domestic happiness than the mere temper of a wife. So now that he has money, he's not suffering with that. He feels the lack of an amiable woman, an amiable wife. But if circumstances were different, if he had an amiable wife, he would lack then the comforts of money. So he would never be 100% happy. I have not a doubt of it, said Marianne, and I have nothing to regret, nothing but my own folly. Rather say your mother's imprudence, my child, said Mrs. Dashwood. She must be answerable. Now Mrs. Dashwood also sees her wrongs in her conduct during this whole affair. Marianne would not let her proceed, and Eleanor, satisfied that each felt their own error, wished to avoid any survey of the past that might weaken her sister's spirits. She therefore, pursuing the first subject, immediately continued. One observation may, I think, be fairly drawn from the whole of the story, that all Willoughby's difficulties have arisen from the first offence against virtue in his behaviour to Eliza Williams. That crime has been the origin of every lesser one and of all his present discontents. Marianne assented most feelingly to the remark, and her mother was led by it to an enumeration of Colonel Brandon's injuries and merits, warm as friendship and design could unitedly dictate. Her daughter did not look, however, as if much of it were heard by her. Eleanor, according to her expectation, saw on the two or three following days, that Marianne did not continue to gain strength as she had done. But while her resolution was unsubdued, and she still tried to appear cheerful and easy, her sister could safely trust the effect of time upon her health. Margaret returned, and the family were again all restored to each other, again quietly settled at the cottage, and if not pursuing their usual studies with quite so much vigor as when they first came to Barton, at least planning a vigorous prosecution of them in future. I love it how the Dashwoods are not idle, right? They are always using their time efficiently. And they like to study, to read. That's great. And this upbringing is what makes them different from the Miss Steeles, for instance, right? As we've seen. Eleanor grew impatient for some tidings of Edward. She had heard nothing of him since her leaving London, nothing new of his plans, nothing certain even of his present abode. Some letters had passed between her and her brother in consequence of Marianne's illness, and in the first of John's there had been this sentence: "We know nothing of our unfortunate Edward, and can make no inquiries on so prohibited a subject, but conclude him to be still at Oxford," which was all the intelligence of Edward afforded her by the correspondence, for his name was not even mentioned in any of the succeeding letters. She was not doomed, however, to be long in ignorance of his measures. So it's been weeks, and she has not heard of Edward anymore, and she's curious whatever happened to him after Colonel Brandon offered the living of Delaford to him that could maybe facilitate the marriage between him and um, Lucy Steele. Their manservant had been sent one morning to Exeter on business, and when, as he waited at table, he had satisfied the inquiries of his mistress as to the event of his errand, this was his voluntary communication. I suppose you know, ma'am, that Mr. Ferrars is married. Marianne gave a violent start, fixed her eyes upon Eleanor, saw her turning pale, and fell back in her chair in hysterics. Giving vent to her emotions, she cannot control it this time when she hears that Mr. Ferrars is married. Mrs. Dashwood, whose eyes, as she answered the servant's inquiry, had intuitively taken the same direction, was shocked to perceive by Eleanor's countenance how much she really suffered, and in a moment afterwards, alike distressed by Marianne's situation, knew not on which child to bestow her principal attention. The servant, who saw only that Miss Marianne was taken ill, had sense enough to call one of the maids, who, with Mrs. Dashwood's assistance, supported her into the other room. By that time Marianne was rather better, and her mother, leaving her to the care of Margaret and the maid, returned to Eleanor, who, though still much disordered, had so far recovered the use of her reason and voice as to be just beginning an inquiry of Thomas, the servant, as to the source of his intelligence. Mrs. Dashwood immediately took all that trouble on herself, and Eleanor had the benefit of the information without the exertion of seeking it. Who told you that Mr. Ferrars was married, Thomas? I see Mr. Ferrars myself, ma'am, this morning in Exeter, and his lady too, Miss Steele as was. They was stopping in a chaise at the door of the New London Inn as I went there with a message from Sally at the park to her brother, who is one of the post-boys. I happened to look up as I went by the chaise, and so I see directly it was the youngest Miss Steele. So I took off my hat, and she knew me, and called to me, and inquired after you, ma'am, and the young ladies, especially Miss Marianne, and bid me I should keep her compliments and Mr. Ferrars, their best compliments and service, and how sorry they was they had not time to come on and see you, but they was in a great hurry to go forwards, for they was going further down for a little while, but howsoever when they come back, they'd make sure to come and see you. But did she tell you she was married, Thomas? Yes, ma'am. She smiled and said how she had changed her name since she was in these parts. She was always a very affable and free-spoken young lady, and very civil behaved, so I made free to wish her joy. Was Mr. Ferrars in the carriage with her? Yes, ma'am. I just see him leaning back in it, but he did not look up. He never was a gentleman much for talking. Eleanor's heart could easily account for his not putting himself forward, and Mrs. Dashwood probably found the same explanation. Was there no one else in the carriage? No, ma'am, only they two. Do you know where they came from? They come straight from town, as Mrs. Ferrars, told me. Are they going farther westward? Yes, ma'am, but not to bide long. They will soon be back again, and then they'd be sure and call here. Mrs. Dashwood now looked at her daughter, but Eleanor knew better than to expect them. She recognized the whole of Lucy in the message, and was very confident that Edward would never come near them. She observed in a low voice to her mother that they were probably going down to Mr. Pratt's near Plymouth. Thomas's intelligence seemed over. Eleanor looked as if she wished to hear more. Did you see them off before you came away? No, ma'am, the horses was just coming out, but I could not bide any longer. I was afraid of being late. Did Mrs. Ferrars look well? Yes, ma'am, she said how she was very well, and to my mind she was always a very handsome young lady, and she seemed vastly contented. Mrs. Dashwood could think of no other question, and Thomas and the tablecloth, now alike needless, were soon afterwards dismissed. Marianne had already sent to say that she should eat nothing more. Mrs. Dashwood's and Eleanor's appetites were equally lost, and Margaret might think herself very well off, that with so much uneasiness as both her sisters had lately experienced, so much reason as they had often had to be careless of their meals, she had never been obliged to go without her dinner before. When the dessert and the wine were arranged, and Mrs. Dashwood and Eleanor were left by themselves, they remained long together in a similarity of thoughtfulness and silence. Mrs. Dashwood feared to hazard any remark, and ventured not to offer consolation. She now found that she had erred in relying on Eleanor's representation of herself, and justly concluded that everything had been expressly softened at the time to spare her from an increase of unhappiness, suffering as she then had suffered for Marianne. She found that she had been misled by the careful, the considerate attention of her daughter to think the attachment which once she had so well understood much slighter in reality than she had been wont to believe, or than it was now proved to be. She feared that under this persuasion she had been unjust, inattentive, nay, almost unkind to her Eleanor. That Marianne's affliction, because more acknowledged more immediately before her, had too much engrossed her tenderness, and led her away to forget that in Eleanor she might have a daughter suffering almost as much, certainly with less self provocation and greater fortitude. I love the end of this chapter. What do you think about Mrs. Dashwood's um, realization about how she has treated her daughters and um, how she should have been, maybe how she should have acted differently towards Eleanor? This is the end of chapter 11 in volume 3, or chapter 47. And it is an interesting chapter, right? Both sisters are suffering, but they have each other, they have their home, and they have their sister Margaret, and especially their mother, which is very important. So, in this chapter, Eleanor tells Mrs. Dashwood about Willoughby's explanation and apology, and Marianne says she is satisfied and even relieved. She comes to realize that she would never have been truly happy with Willoughby, and also that Willoughby would have never been truly happy with her, so it could not be a happy relationship after all. And Eleanor says it's because of Willoughby's selfishness. He has only ever had his interest in mind, not Marianne's happiness. And then at the end of the chapter, a servant says that Mr. Ferrars is married to Miss Steele, and Eleanor is devastated, and Mrs. Dashwood realizes she has neglected her Eleanor's suffering because it was not as explicit as Marianne's. So it was clear Marianne was suffering because she showed it all the time. But Eleanor was suffering just as much, but she was not showing it. But that does not mean that she did not need her mother's support or her sister's support. And finally, Mrs. Dashwood understands that she may have neglected Marianne's feelings just because they were not as apparent as Marianne's. Jenny says, it's sad that Mrs. Dashwood had not realized how unhappy Eleanor was. Yes, no one realized, because Marianne has, Eleanor puts on this facade, and she has such fortitude, such exertion, that it looks like everything is fine. It looks like it. But beneath the surface, she suffers just as much. So Jane Austen is quite smart here, right? She shows how two girls, very different girls with very different personalities, suffer the same amount of suffering, of course, for different reasons, but how they show it differently. But the show of feeling does not make it um, uh, more powerful than the feeling that is not shown, that is repressed, right? Um, two extremes, actually. So we've talked about this before. This is the main theme in Sense and Sensibility. It's in the title. So both of them have to come to terms with either a lack of sense or a lack of sensibility and find a balance that will lead them to happiness. Um, all right, so let's continue. Let's read about Eleanor's unhappiness. It is quite sad. She's the predominant voice in this novel, right? Because as she doesn't act much and doesn't show much, we uh, read a lot of what's in her mind. Uh, with other characters, it's more about what they say and what they do, right? Michelle says, it's actually a relief to see Eleanor in hysterics and showing emotion. It needs to come out. Yes, it needs to come out. Finally, she lets it loose and she will do it. She will do it more. So you will see how. So now Marianne is trying to be a bit more like Eleanor, right? And we'll see now Eleanor trying to be a bit more like Marianne. That's in chapter 12, volume 3, or chapter 48. Eleanor now found the difference between the expectation of an unpleasant event, however certain the mind may be told to consider it, and certainty itself. I love this extract. Although Eleanor knew this was coming, that Edward would be married to someone else, still there's a very big difference between the expectation of a certainty and the certainty itself. She now found that in spite of herself, she had always admitted a hope, while Edward remained single, that something would occur to prevent his marrying Lucy, that some resolution of his own, some mediation of friends, or some more eligible opportunity of establishment for the lady would arise to assist the happiness of all. But he was now married, and she condemned her heart for the lurking flattery which so much heightened the pain of the intelligence. Now she realizes that she had, although she didn't believe so, and she tried not to, she had um, kept hope, as little as it might be, that things would change and maybe take a different direction. And now she suffers the more for having allowed herself to hope, even if unconsciously. That he should be married so soon, before, as she imagined, he could be in orders, and consequently before he could be in possession of the living, surprised her a little at first. But she soon saw how likely it was that Lucy, in her self provident care, in her haste to secure him, should overlook everything but the risk of delay. They were married in town, and now hastening down to her uncle's. What had Edward felt on being within 4 miles of Barton, on seeing her mother's servant, on hearing Lucy's message? They would soon, she supposed, be settled at Delaford. Delaford is Colonel Brandon's estate. Delaford, that place in which so much conspired to give her an interest, which she wished to be acquainted with and yet desired to avoid. Wished to be acquainted with for the sake of Marianne, if Marianne decided to finally um, respond to Colonel Brandon's affections, but at the same time she avoided it because that will be the place where Edward would live with his wife. She saw them in an instant in their parsonage house in her mind, right? Saw in Lucy the active, contriving manager, uniting at once a desire of smart appearance with the utmost frugality, and ashamed to be suspected of half her economical practices, pursuing her own interest in every thought, courting the favor of Colonel Brandon, of Mrs. Jennings, and of every wealthy friend. In Edward she knew not what she saw, nor what she wished to see, happy or unhappy. Nothing pleased her. She turned away her head from every sketch of him. Eleanor flattered herself that some one of their connections in London would write to them to announce the event and give farther particulars. But day after day passed off and brought no letter, no tidings. Though uncertain that anyone were to blame, she found fault with every absent friend. They were all thoughtless or indolent. She wants to know more, and no one says anything. Not one of their acquaintances sends any information by letter. When do you write to Colonel Brandon, ma'am? Was an inquiry which sprung from the impatience of her mind to have something going on. I wrote to him, my love, last week, and rather expect to see than to hear from him again. I earnestly pressed his coming to us, and should not be surprised to see him walk in today, or tomorrow, or any day. This was gaining something to look forward to. Colonel Brandon must have some information to give. Scarcely had she so determined it, when the figure of a man on horseback drew her eyes to the window. He stopped at their gate. It was a gentleman. It was Colonel Brandon himself. Now she should hear more, and she trembled in expectation of it. But it was not Colonel Brandon, neither his air nor his height. Were it possible, she should say it must be Edward. She looked again. He had just dismounted. She could not be mistaken. It was Edward. She moved away and sat down. He comes from Mr. Pratt's purposely to see us. I will be calm. I will be mistress of myself. That is a very famous quote from Jane Austen. Perhaps you've read it or heard it before. And this is the context in which she says it. I will be calm. I will be mistress of myself. In a moment, she perceived that the others were likewise aware of the mistake. She saw her mother and Marianne change color, saw them look at herself and whisper a few sentences to each other. She would have given the world to be able to speak, and to make them understand that she hoped no coolness, no slight would appear in their behavior to him. But she had no utterance, and was obliged to leave all to their own discretion. Not a syllable passed aloud. They all waited in silence for the appearance of their visitor. His footsteps were heard along the gravel path. In a moment he was in the passage, and in another he was before them. She's building the expectation here, right? She's normally very direct and straight to the point, but here she takes the time to describe Edward's coming, to build the expectation, and also to mirror the feelings that Eleanor is feeling. Anticipation, like, oh, what is he doing here? What am I going to do? I have to be mistress of myself. His countenance, as he entered the room, was not too happy, even for Eleanor. His complexion was white with agitation, and he looked as if fearful of his reception, and conscious that he merited no kind one. Mrs. Dashwood, however, conforming, as she trusted, to the wishes of that daughter, by whom she then meant in the warmth of her heart to be guided in everything, met him with a look of forced complacency, gave him her hand, and wished him joy. He colored and stammered out an unintelligible reply. Eleanor's lips had moved with her mother's, and when the moment of action was over, she wished that she had shaken hands with him too. But it was then too late, and with a countenance meaning to be open, she sat down again and talked of the weather. That's easier, right, to talk about the weather than to talk about what is actually important. Marianne had retreated as much as possible out of sight to conceal her distress, and Margaret, understanding some part but not the whole of the case, thought it incumbent on her to be dignified, and therefore took a seat as far from him as she could, and maintained a strict silence. When Eleanor had ceased to rejoice in the dryness of the season, a very awful pause took place. It was put an end to by Mrs. Dashwood, who felt obliged to hope that he had left Mrs. Ferrars very well. In a hurried manner he replied in the affirmative. Another pause. Eleanor, resolving to exert herself, though fearing the sound of her own voice, now said, Is Mrs. Ferrars at Longstaple? At Longstaple? He replied with an air of surprise. No, my mother is in town. I meant, said Eleanor, taking up some work from the table, to inquire after Mrs. Edward Ferrars. She dared not look up, for her mother and Marian both turned their eyes on him. He colored, seemed perplexed, looked doubtingly, and after some hesitation said, "Perhaps you mean my brother? You mean Mrs. Robert Ferrars?" "Mrs. Robert Ferrars?" was repeated by Marian and her mother in an accent of the utmost amazement. And though Eleanor could not speak, even her eyes were fixed on him with the same impatient wonder. He rose from his seat and walked to the window, apparently from not knowing what to do, took a pair of scissors that lay there, and while spoiling both them and their sheath by cutting the letter to pieces as he spoke, said in a hurried voice, "Perhaps you do not know, you may not have heard that my brother is lately married to the youngest, to Miss Lucy Steele." Aha, so Lucy is married to Mr. Ferrars, but not Edward Ferrars. Robert Ferrars. How did that happen? Let me know. Was that surprising for you? Did you see it coming? Or perhaps it's not the first time you read the novel. But how do you feel about this pair, this couple, Robert Ferrars and Lucy Steele? His words were echoed with unspeakable astonishment by all but Eleanor, who sat with her head leaning over her work, in a state of such agitation as made her hardly know where she was. "Yes," said he, "they were married last week, and are now at Dawlish." Eleanor could sit it no longer. She almost ran out of the room, and as soon as the door was closed, burst into tears of joy, which at first she thought would never cease. So she bursts. She's too agitated, too many feelings, too many emotions. She almost lost complete control. She almost ran, but she managed to walk away. And as soon as the door was closed, she gave vent to all her feelings, to tears of joy. Jenny says, "Did not see that coming. However, Robert is now the heir, and so has money." Indeed. So, what does that tell us about Lucy's affections for Edward and her perhaps financial interests, right? We'll see. No real affection for Edward, definitely, otherwise she would not have changed. And so suddenly, from one Ferrars to the next, right? So it was not about Edward, the man, the person, but about what Edward Ferrars represented: the money, the title, the future, the comfort, etc. And now it's beautiful how Eleanor vents her emotions. Edward, who had till then looked anywhere rather than at her, saw her hurry away, and perhaps saw, or even heard, her emotion. For immediately afterwards he fell into a reverie which no remarks, no inquiries, no affectionate address of Mrs. Dashwood could penetrate, could not hear anything else. And at last, without saying a word, quitted the room and walked out towards the village, leaving the others in the greatest astonishment and perplexity on a change in his situation, so wonderful and so sudden, a perplexity which they had no means of lessening but by their own conjectures. Like, what happened, right? Michelle says, "I'm glad Lucy did not win. I literally cannot stand her." Yes, then she did not win Edward, but in a way she did win, right? We'll talk about it later on when we know more about the deal with Robert. But she is seen by everyone as such a silly girl, uneducated. Um, she flatters everyone, tries to get advantage wherever she is by, you know, uh, giving compliments and trying to ease her way into the company of people in a higher social rank. Remember how she used to flatter Lady Middleton, Fanny Dashwood, before she knew about the whole thing. So she is she? That is the question. Is she such a silly girl? Jenny says she's scheming. Yes, she's just the well, she's the daughter of a common person, right? She is the niece of a tutor, so not from the gentry, not from the her family does not have a title, does not have money. But look at where she is now, how much she has climbed in the social ladder, right? So in a way she is silly, yes, but she's also very, very smart. So in this chapter, chapter 12 of volume 3, or chapter 48, we talked about how Eleanor wants to know more about Miss Steele's marriage, about what she thought was Edward's marriage, but there's no information. They're expecting Colonel Brandon, who may know more, but instead of Colonel Brandon, and that's not the first thing that it happens. Remember once? No, then it was the other way around. They were expecting, Marion was expecting Willoughby, and Colonel Brandon arrives. Now they were expecting Colonel Brandon, and it was in fact Edward himself. And they find out that Lucy, um, they inquire after Mrs. Dashwood, thinking of Lucy, and Edward thinks of his own mother, Mrs. Ferris. And soon the miscommunication is solved, and they learn that Lucy is also married to Robert Ferris. And remember how Robert, in a conversation with Eleanor, what he said to Eleanor about Lucy, how she was such a simple country girl, and how Edward was throwing his life away by marrying such a simpleton. And now there he is. Let's see what we can know more in chapter 49 or chapter 13 of volume 3. And that is the one before the last, so we're moving towards the end. Unaccountable, however, as the circumstances of his release might appear to the whole family, it was certain that Edward was free. And to what purpose that freedom would be employed was easily predetermined by all. For after experiencing the blessings of one imprudent engagement, that's very sarcastic and ironic. The blessings, it was not a blessing at all, right? For after experiencing the blessings of one imprudent engagement, contracted without his mother's consent, as he had already done for more than 4 years, nothing less could be expected of him in the failure of that than the immediate contraction of another. I love this part, how sarcastic the narrator is. So, she had already disappointed his mother once because of an engagement. He might as well do it again. But now, because of the woman he really loves. His errand at Barton, in fact, was a simple one. It was only to ask Eleanor to marry him. And considering that he was not altogether inexperienced in such a question, it might be strange that he should feel so uncomfortable in the present case as he really did, so much in need of encouragement and fresh air. You can imagine, right? How soon he had walked himself into the proper resolution, however, how soon an opportunity of exercising it occurred, in what manner he expressed himself, and how he was received, need not be particularly told. What? So, as a reader, you may think, what, narrator? You've told us a lot about a lot of things and described a lot of things, and now you're not going to tell us how Edward proposed to Eleanor? Yes, the narrator withholds this information. It does not describe how Edward's proposal went, what he said, how Eleanor felt, what she responded, where it took place, who was there. We don't know. Why do you think the narrator does that? Rob us of this scene. That's a very interesting thought. And that's not exclusive to Sense and Sensibility, but Jane Austen tends to make either proposals or marriage scenes really fast, really straight to the point. So she's more concerned about what comes before marriage and what comes after, the consequences, the act itself, the marriage itself is not important. This only need be said, that's the narrator's voice, that when they all sat down to table at 4 o'clock, about 3 hours after his arrival, he had secured his lady, engaged her mother's consent, and was not only in the rapturous profession of the lover, but in the reality of reason and truth, one of the happiest men. His situation indeed was more than commonly joyful. He had more than the ordinary triumph of accepted love to swell his heart and raise his spirits. He was released without any reproach to himself from an entanglement which had long formed his misery, from a woman whom he had long ceased to love, and elevated at once to that security with another which he must have thought of almost with despair as soon as he had learned to consider it with desire. He was brought not from doubt or suspense, but from misery to happiness. And the change was openly spoken in such a genuine, flowing, grateful cheerfulness as his friends had never witnessed in him before. So he's very happy. His heart was now open to Eleanor, all its weaknesses, all its errors confessed, and his first boyish attachment to Lucy treated with all the philosophic dignity of 24 years old. He's now 24 years old, so wise and old for the time. And he can look back at his engagement with Lucy as a childish, boyish attachment, and he's telling Eleanor everything. So that's a good beginning of a relationship. His heart is open to Eleanor, all its weaknesses and all its errors confessed. It was a foolish, idle inclination of my side, said he, the consequence of ignorance of the world and want of employment. Had my mother given me some active profession when I was removed at 18 from the care of Mr. Pratt, I think, nay, I'm sure, it would never have happened. For though I left Longstaple with what I thought at the time a most unconquerable preference for his niece, yet had I then had any pursuit, any object to engage my time and keep me at a distance from her for a few months, I should very soon have outgrown the fancied attachment, especially by mixing more with the world, as in such a case I must have done. But instead of having anything to do, instead of having any profession chosen for me, or being allowed to choose any myself, I returned home to be completely idle. And for the first 12 months afterwards, I had not even the nominal employment which belonging to the university would have given me, for I was not entered at Oxford till I was 19. I had therefore nothing in the world to do but to fancy myself in love. So that's quite interesting. And also, you can identify Jane Austen's criticism here about idle men. So, without a purpose in life, without a profession, without any employment, just being idle. So, Edward had nothing to do. So, he used his time fancying he was in love with this woman. But he did not know many other women. He had not had much experience outside of that bubble where he was from. He did not study, he did not work, he did not have purpose in life. So he explains to Eleanor it's no wonder that he felt attached to Lucy. And he explains further. And as my mother did not make my home in every respect comfortable, as I had no friend, no companion in my brother, and disliked new acquaintance, it was not unnatural for me to be very often at Longstaple, where I always felt myself at home, and was always sure of a welcome. And accordingly I spent the greatest part of my time there from 18 to 19. Lucy appeared everything that was amiable and obliging. She was pretty too, at least I thought so then, and I had seen so little of other women that I could make no comparisons and see no defects. Considering everything, therefore, I hope, foolish as our engagement was, foolish as it has since in every way been proved, it was not at the time an unnatural or an inexcusable piece of folly. I feel sorry for Edward, right? So he complains about his life having no purpose and also about being lonely because his mother did not make their home welcome. He had not a companion in his brother. He did not have friends. He disliked meeting new people. He's a very introvert. So He felt at home, he felt safe, he felt good in the company of Lucy and her uncle. Um, so that's completely understandable, right? But the situation changed. The change which a few hours had wrought in the minds and the happiness of the Dashwoods was such, so great, as promised them all the satisfaction of a sleepless night. Mrs. Dashwood, too happy to be comfortable, knew not how to love Edward, nor praise Eleanor enough, how to be enough thankful for his release without wounding his delicacy, nor how at once to give them leisure for unrestrained conversation together, and yet enjoy, as she wished, the sight and society of both. Marianne could speak her happiness only by tears. Comparisons would occur, regrets would arise, and her joy, though sincere as her love for her sister, was of a kind to give her neither spirits nor language. Marianne is overcome. She cannot talk. She has no spirit or language. She speaks her happiness by tears. So she's crying, and they're both tears of joy and sadness. Joy for Eleanor's happiness, and sadness because she cannot help but compare her situation with Eleanor's and compare Willoughby's fickleness with Edward's constancy. But Eleanor, how are her feelings to be described? Let's see. Let's. This is very important. Now we're talking about Eleanor's development. We talked about Marianne's journey. Now it is Eleanor's journey to find joy in experiencing and in letting show her emotions. From the moment of learning that Lucy was married to another, that Edward was free, to the moment of his justifying the hopes which had so instantly followed, she was everything by turns but tranquil. But when the second moment had passed, when she found every doubt, every solicitude removed, compared her situation with what so lately it had been, saw him honorably released from his former engagement, saw him instantly profiting by the release to address herself and declare an affection as tender, as constant as she had ever supposed it to be. She was oppressed. She was overcome by her own felicity. And happily disposed as is the human mind to be easily familiarized with any change for the better, it required several hours to give sedateness to her spirits or any degree of tranquility to her heart. I love it. She's so happiness that she's oppressed by feelings, oppressed by her own felicity, because it's such an overwhelming force that she had tried to keep away, that she feels oppressed, but she has no tranquility. um, Felicity, I think it means degree. Where was it? Felicity. She was oppressed. She was overcome by her own felicity, by her own happiness, um, and it's such a powerful feeling that she had never let herself feel before, and she's overwhelmed by her own felicity, by her own happiness. Edward was now fixed at the cottage at least for a week. For whatever other claims might be made on him, it was impossible that less than a week should be given up to the enjoyment of Eleanor's company, or suffice to say half that was to be said of the past, the present, and the future. For though a very few hours spent in the hard labor of incessant talking will dispatch more subjects than can really be in common between any two rational creatures, yet with lovers it is different. Between them, no subject is finished, no communication is even made till it has been made at least 20 times over. I love this. So, whatever they had to say to each other, they could have said it uh, in less than, well, in a few hours. That would have been the case with any two rational creatures, but not with lovers. When they are lovers, you can say the same thing 20 times. It doesn't matter. It's not about what they say, but about being together, right? Lucy's marriage, the unceasing and reasonable wonder among them all, formed, of course, one of the earliest discussions of the lovers. And Eleanor's particular knowledge of each party made it appear to her in every view as one of the most extraordinary and unaccountable circumstances she had ever heard. How they could be thrown together, and by what attraction Robert could be drawn on to marry a girl of whose beauty she had herself heard him speak without any admiration. A girl, too, already engaged to his brother, and on whose account that brother had been thrown off by his family, it was beyond her comprehension to make out. Um, to her own heart, it was a delightful affair. To her imagination, it was even a ridiculous one. But to her reason and to her judgment, it was completely a puzzle. Now she needs to understand whatever happened to Robert and Lucy for them to get together, such um, an unreasonable, unexpected couple. Edward could only attempt an explanation by supposing that, perhaps at first accidentally meeting, the vanity of the one had been so worked on by the flattery of the other as to lead by degrees to all the rest. And I think that's very perceptive of Edward. The vanity of Robert, his pride, his love in being admired, and Lucy's flattery, her skills in making the other person feel wanted, feel desired, feel complimented, that combination worked. Eleanor remembered what Robert had told her in Harley Street of his opinion of what his own mediation in his brother's affairs might have done if applied to it in time. She repeated it to Edward. That was exactly like Robert, was his immediate observation. And that, he presently added, might perhaps be in his head when the acquaintance between them first began. And Lucy perhaps at first might think only of procuring his good offices in my favour. Other designs might afterwards arise. How long it had been carrying on between them, however, he was equally at a loss with herself to make out. For at Oxford, where he had remained by choice ever since his quitting London, he had had no means of hearing of her but from herself, and her letters to the very last were neither less frequent nor less affectionate than usual. Not the smallest suspicion, therefore, had ever occurred to prepare him for what followed. And when at last it burst on him in a letter from Lucy herself, she had been for some time, he believed, half stupefied between the wonder, the horror, and the joy of such a deliverance. He put the letter into Eleanor's hands. So let's see what Lucy wrote to Edward. Remember, she continued sending him letters as frequently and as affectionate as usual until this letter came all of a sudden. Dear Sir, look at the formality. Dear Sir, being very sure I have long lost your affections, I have thought myself at liberty to bestow my own on another, and have no doubt of being as happy with him as I once used to think I might be with you. But I scorn to accept a hand while the heart was another's. Sincerely wish you happy in your choice, and it shall not be my fault if we are not always good friends, as our near relationship now makes proper. I can safely say I owe you no ill will, and am sure you will be too generous to do us any ill offices. Your brother has gained my affections entirely, and as we could not live without one another, we are just returned from the altar, and are now on our way to Dawlish for a few weeks, which place your dear brother has great curiosity to see, but thought I would first trouble you with these few lines, and shall always remain your sincere well-wisher, friend and sister, Lucy Ferrers. Can you imagine Edward's reaction when he got this letter? Oh, and there's a PS here. I have burnt all your letters and will return your picture the first opportunity. Please do destroy my scrawls, but the ring with my hair you are very welcome to keep. Eleanor read and returned it without any comment. I will not ask your opinion of it as a composition, said Edward. For worlds would not I have had a letter of hers seen by you in former days. In a sister it is bad enough, but in a wife, how I have blushed over the pages of her writing. Now Edward's being harsh here. He feels embarrassed about the way that um, Lucy had written her writing style because she lacked formal education. So, right? Um, He continues, and I believe I may say that since the first half year of our foolish business, this is the only letter I ever received from her of which the substance made me any amends for the defect of the style. However it may have come about, said Eleanor after a pause, they are certainly married, and your mother has brought on herself a most appropriate punishment. Yes, think about Edward's mother. So he cut Edward off because he wanted to marry Lucy Steele. So she gave all the inheritance and money that would have fallen on Edward as first son to Robert, and Robert goes and marries who? Lucy Steele. So Eleanor sees it as a punishment for his mother. The independence she settled on Robert through resentment against you has put it in his power to make his own choice. And she has actually been bribing one son with 1,000 a year to do the very deed which she disinherited the other for intending to do. That is so true. She will hardly be less hurt, I suppose, by Robert's marrying Lucy than she would have been by your marrying her. Misha says this woman is completely insufferable. She is, and there's more. Let's see. I'm not going to spoil anything, but let's see how she reacts, how Mrs. Ferris reacts to this whole new engagement. She will be more hurt by it, for Robert always was her favorite. She will be more hurt by it, and on the same principle, will forgive him much sooner. So Edward says that Robert has always been his mother's favorite. So for that reason, she will be even more hurt because of this secret marriage, not engagement, marriage now. But on the same principle, because she loves him so much and he's her favorite, he thinks she will forgive him more easily. In what state the affair stood at present between them, Edward knew not, for no communication with any of his family had yet been attempted by him. He had quitted Oxford within 24 hours after Lucy's letter arrived, and with only one object before him, the nearest road to Barton, had had no leisure to form any scheme of conduct with which the road did not hold the most intimate connection. He could do nothing till he were assured of his fate with Miss Dashwood. And by his rapidity in seeking that fate, it is to be supposed, in spite of the jealousy with which he had once thought of Colonel Brandon, in spite of the modesty with which he rated his own deserts, and the politeness with which he talked of his doubts, he did not, upon the whole, expect a very cruel reception. It was his business, however, to say that he did, and he said it very prettily. What he might say on the subject a 12 month after must be referred to the imagination of husbands and wives. That Lucy had certainly meant to deceive, to go off with a flourish of malice against him in her message by Thomas, was perfectly clear to Eleanor. That is so true. Remember the message that the servant brought home from Lucy Steele? She said, more or less, tell Eleanor that I am married and that I am Mrs. Ferrars. What did she intend that Eleanor understood from this um, information? That she had married Edward and would be jealous and would be wretched. And that's exactly what happened. So you see how scheming she was. And Eleanor knew that Lucy had meant to deceive when she said those words to the servant. And Edward himself, now thoroughly enlightened on her character, had no scruple in believing her capable of the utmost meanness of wanton ill nature. Though his eyes had been long opened, even before his acquaintance with Eleanor began, to her ignorance and a want of liberality in some of her opinions, they had been equally imputed by him to her want of education. Until her last letter reached him, he had always believed her to be a well disposed, good hearted girl and thoroughly attached to himself. Nothing but such a persuasion could have prevented his putting an end to an engagement which long before the discovery of it laid open to his mother's anger and had been a continual source of disquiet and regret to him. So he really believed that Lucy liked him and that she was a good-hearted girl. That is why he had not broken the engagement. But now he knows, he sees her true colors. Jenny says she wanted Eleanor to think she had married Edward. So horrible. Yes, such a sly creature, huh? She really wanted Eleanor to suffer. I thought it my duty, said he, independent of my feelings, to give her the option of continuing the engagement or not, when I was renounced by my mother, and stood to all appearance without a friend in the world to assist me. In such a situation as that, where there seemed nothing to tempt the avarice or the vanity of any living creature, how could I suppose, when she so earnestly, so warmly insisted on sharing my fate, whatever it might be, that anything but the most disinterested affection was her endorsement? And even now, I cannot comprehend on what motive she acted, or what fancied advantage it could be to her to be fettered to a man for whom she had not the smallest regard, and who had only £2,000 in the world. She could not foresee that Colonel Brandon would give me a living. No, but she might suppose that something would occur in your favor. Now that's Eleanor. So they are thinking. Edward was thinking. So why did Lucy keep the engagement when I gave her the option to break it? Even after I was refused by my family and my fortune passed on to Robert. Why would she continue the engagement if she didn't love me? And Eleanor is very perceptive. She might suppose that something would occur in your favor, that your own family might in time relent. And at any rate, she lost nothing by continuing the engagement, for she has proved that it fettered neither her inclination nor her actions. The connection was certainly a respectable one, and probably gained her consideration among her friends. And if nothing more advantageous occurred, it would be better for her to marry you than be single. That's it, that's true. Edward was, of course, immediately convinced that nothing could have been more natural than Lucy's conduct, nor more self evident than the motive of it. Eleanor scolded him, harshly as ladies always scold the impudence which compliments themselves, for having spent so much time with them at Norland when he must have felt his own inconstancy. Now Eleanor is um, scolding him in a friendly way for having stayed at Norland Park too much in the beginning of the novel when he was already engaged. So he spent too much time with Eleanor, made her believe that he had affections for her. He should not have done that if he was as he was engaged. Your behavior was certainly very wrong, said she, because, to say nothing of my own conviction, our relations were all led away by it to fancy and expect what, as you were then situated, could never be. He could only plead an ignorance of his own heart and a mistaken confidence in the force of his engagement. I was simple enough to think that because my faith was plighted to another, there could be no danger in my being with you, and that the consciousness of my engagement was to keep my heart as safe and sacred as my honor. I felt that I admired you, but I told myself it was only friendship. Until I began to make comparisons between yourself and Lucy, I did not know how far I was got. After that, I suppose I was wrong in remaining so much in Sussex, and the arguments with which I reconciled myself to the expediency of it were no better than this. The danger is my own. I am doing no injury to anybody but myself. But he was injuring Eleanor by giving her false hopes. Eleanor smiled and shook her head. Edward heard with pleasure of Colonel Brandon's being expected at the cottage, as he really wished not only to be better acquainted with him, but to have an opportunity of convincing him that he no longer resented his giving him the living of Delaford. Which at present, said he, after thanks so ungraciously delivered as mine were on the occasion, he must think I have never forgiven him for offering. Because Edward was not that happy of receiving the living from Colonel Brandon at the time, because that would enable him perhaps to marry Lucy sooner than he thought, and he was not happy about that prospect. But now he wants to thank Colonel Brandon properly. Now he felt astonished himself that he had never yet been to the place. But so little interest had he taken in the matter that he owed all his knowledge of the house, garden, and glebe, extent of the parish, condition of the land, and rate of the tithes to Eleanor herself, who had heard so much of it from Colonel Brandon and heard it with so much attention as to be entirely mistress of the subject. One question after this only remained undecided between them. One difficulty only was to be overcome. They were brought together by mutual affection, with the warmest approbation of their real friends. Their intimate knowledge of each other seemed to make their happiness certain, and they only wanted something to live upon. Edward had £2,000 and Eleanor one, which with Delaford living was all that they could call their own, for it was impossible that Mrs. Dashwood should advance anything, and they were neither of them quite enough in love to think that £350 a year would supply them with the comforts of life. So they are still very practical, reasonable people. So although they are in love, they know they can never be comfortable with this amount of money. So the only thing that stands in their way, the only difficulty now, is money. Edward was not entirely without hopes of some favorable change in his mother towards him, and on that he rested for the residue of their income. But Eleanor had no such dependence. For since Edward would still be unable to marry Miss Morton, and his choosing herself had been spoken of in Mrs. Ferrars's flattering language as only a lesser evil than his choosing Lucy Steele, she feared that Robert's offence would serve no other purpose than to enrich Fanny. About 4 days after Edward's arrival, Colonel Brandon appeared, to complete Mrs. Dashwood's satisfaction, and to give her the dignity of having, for the first time since her living at Barton, more company with her than her house would hold. Edward was allowed to retain the privilege of first comer, and Colonel Brandon therefore walked every night to his old quarters at the park, from whence he usually returned in the morning early enough to interrupt the lovers' first tete-a-tete before breakfast. A 3 weeks' residence at Delaford, where in his evening hours at least he had little to do but to calculate the disproportion between 36 and 17. I feel so sorry for him. He had nothing to pass the time except for thinking about the difference of age between 36, his age, and 17, Marian's. Brought him to Barton in a temper of mind which needed all the improvement in Marian's looks, all the kindness of her welcome, and all the encouragement of her mother's language to make it cheerful. Among such friends, however, and such flattery, he did revive. No rumor of Lucy's marriage had yet reached him. He knew nothing of what had passed, and the first hours of his visit were consequently spent in hearing and in wondering. Everything was explained to him by Mrs. Dashwood, and he found fresh reason to rejoice in what he had done for Edward, for Mr. Ferrars, since eventually it promoted the interest of Eleanor. It would be needless to say that the gentlemen advanced in the good opinion of each other, as they advanced in each other's acquaintance, for it could not be otherwise. Their resemblance in good principles and good sense, in disposition and manner of thinking, would probably have been sufficient to unite them in friendship, without any other attraction. But their being in love with two sisters, and two sisters fond of each other, made that mutual regard inevitable and immediate, which might otherwise have waited the effect of time and judgment. The letters from town, which a few days before would have made every nerve in Eleanor's body thrill with transport, now arrived to be read with less emotion than mirth. Mrs. Jennings wrote to tell the wonderful tale, to vent her honest indignation against the jilting girl, and pour forth her compassion towards poor Mr. Edward, who, she was sure, had quite doted upon the worthless hussy, and was now, by all accounts, almost broken-hearted at Oxford. I do think, she continued, nothing was ever carried on so sly, for it was but 2 days before Lucy called and sat a couple of hours with me. Not a soul suspected anything of the matter, not even Nancy, Lucy's sister, who, poor soul, came crying to me the day after in a great fright for fear of Mrs. Ferrars, as well as not knowing how to get to Plymouth, for Lucy, it seems, borrowed all her money before she went off to be married, On purpose, we supposed to make a show with, and poor Nancy had not 7 shillings in the world. So I was very glad to give her 5 guineas to take her down to Exeter, where she thinks of staying 3 or 4 weeks with Mrs. Burgess, in hopes, as I tell her, to fall in with the doctor again. And I must say that Lucy's crossness not to take her along with them in the chaise is worse than all. Poor Mr. Edwards! I cannot get him out of my head, but you must send for him to Barton, and Miss Marianne must try to comfort him. So Mrs. Jennings, still in the wrong, she thinks that Eleanor might perhaps marry Colonel Brandon. She doesn't know about Edward and Eleanor's engagement yet. And look what Lucy did. She left London with Robert Ferrars, and she left her sister Nancy behind with no money. Look at that. Mr. Dashwood's strains were more solemn. Mrs. Ferrars was the most unfortunate of women. Poor Fanny had suffered agonies of sensibility, and he considered the existence of each under such a blow with grateful wonder. Robert's offense was unpardonable, but Lucy's was infinitely worse. Neither of them was ever again to be mentioned to Mrs. Ferrars, and even if she might hereafter be induced to forgive her son, his wife should never be acknowledged as her daughter, nor be permitted to appear in her presence. She could maybe forgive Robert, but not Lucy. The secrecy with which everything had been carried on between them was rationally treated as enormously heightening the crime, because had any suspicion of it occurred to the others, proper measures would have been taken to prevent the marriage. And he called on Eleanor to join with him in regretting that Lucy's engagement with Edward had not rather been fulfilled than that she should thus be the means of spreading misery farther in the family. He thus continued. Mrs. Ferrars has never yet mentioned Edward's name, which does not surprise us, but to our great astonishment, not a line has been received for him on the occasion. Perhaps, however, he is kept silent by his fear of offending, and I shall therefore give him a hint by a line to Oxford, that his sister and I both think a letter of proper submission from him, addressed perhaps to Fanny, and by her shown to her mother, might not be taken amiss, for we all know the tenderness of Mrs. Ferrars's heart, and that she wishes for nothing so much as to be on good terms with her children. Yeah, right. This paragraph was of some importance to the prospects and conduct of Edward. It determined him to attempt a reconciliation, though not exactly in the manner pointed out by their brother and sister. A letter of proper submission, repeated he. Would they have me beg my mother's pardon for Robert's ingratitude to her and breach of honor to me? I can make no submission. I am grown neither humble nor penitent by what has passed. I am grown very happy, but that would not interest. I know of no submission that is proper for me to make. You may certainly ask to be forgiven, said Eleanor, because you have offended. And I should think you might now venture so far as to profess some concern for having ever formed the engagement which drew on you your mother's anger. He agreed that he might. And when she has forgiven you, perhaps a little humility may be convenient while acknowledging a second engagement, almost as imprudent in her eyes as the first. He had nothing to urge against it, but still resisted the idea of a letter of proper submission. And therefore, to make it easier to him, as he declared a much greater willingness to make mean concessions by word of mouth than on paper, it was resolved that instead of writing to Fanny, he should go to London and personally entreat her good offices in his favor. And if they really do interest themselves, said Marianne in her new character of candor, in bringing about a reconciliation, I shall think that even John and Fanny are not entirely without merit. After a visit on Colonel Brandon's side of only 3 or 4 days, the two gentlemen quitted Barton together. They were to go immediately to Delaford, that Edward might have some personal knowledge of his future home, and assist his patron and friend in deciding on what improvements were needed to it. And from thence, after staying there a couple of nights, he was to proceed on his journey to town. This is the end of chapter 13, volume 3, or chapter 49, the one chapter before the last. So here we find out that Eleanor and Edward are engaged, although the narrator doesn't describe the proposal, which is quite interesting. So Jane Austen is more concerned with exploring the social relationships um, of the people, and the marriage itself is not really relevant, right? Um, it's not about finding a happy ending, about living happily ever after. It's about the difficulties of women in reaching complete happiness or partial happiness and sufficient happiness, and the consequences of these choices for them and for others, not necessarily the event itself. Do you know what I mean? And Jane Austen is very adamant in that. All right, so let's start the last chapter of Sense and Sensibility. Let's see how the narrator, the author, will finish the story. And yes, let me just be sure. There is no more dialogue, so we don't hear um, Eleanor's voice anymore, or Marian's voice anymore. Um, it's a kind of wrapping up, like at the end of a movie, where the narrator or the voiceover explains what happened to each one of the characters. It's more or less like that. So let's see. Chapter 50. After a proper resistance on the part of Mrs. Ferrars, just so violent and so steady as to preserve her from that reproach which she always seemed fearful of incurring, the reproach of being too amiable, Edward was admitted to her presence and pronounced to be again her son. Um, So Edward and his mother are reconciled, but Mrs. Ferrars did not want to be seen as too amiable. So she took the time to forgive him, but then pronounced him to be her son again. Her family had of late been exceedingly fluctuating. For many years of her life, she had had two sons. But the crime and annihilation of Edward a few weeks ago had robbed her of one. The similar annihilation of Robert had left her for a fortnight without any. And now, by the resuscitation of Edward, she had one again. In spite of his being allowed once more to live, look at the sarcasm in the narrator's voice. However, he did not feel the continuance of his existence secure till he had revealed his present engagement, for the publication of that circumstance, he feared, might give a sudden turn to his constitution and carry him off as rapidly as before. With apprehensive caution, therefore, it was revealed, and he was listened to with unexpected calmness. Mrs. Ferrars at first reasonably endeavored to dissuade him from marrying Miss Dashwood by every argument in her power. Told him that in Miss Morton he would have a woman of higher rank and larger fortune, and enforced the assertion by observing that Miss Morton was the daughter of a nobleman with 30,000 pounds, while Miss Dashwood was only the daughter of a private gentleman with no more than three. But when she found out that, though perfectly admitting the truth of her representation, he was by no means inclined to be guided by it, she judged it wisest, from the experience of the past, to submit. And therefore, after such an ingracious delay as she owed to her own dignity, and as served to prevent every suspicion of goodwill, she issued her decree of consent to the marriage of Edward and Eleanor. What she would engage to do towards augmenting their income was next to be considered. And here it plainly appeared that though Edward was now her only son, he was by no means her eldest. For while Robert was inevitably endowed with 1,000 pounds a year, not the smallest objection was made against Edward's taking orders for the sake of 250 at the utmost, nor was anything promised either for the present or in future beyond the 10,000 pounds which had been given with Fanny. So look at that. In spite of being welcomed back into the family, Mrs. Ferrars does not do anything for them financially. So they do not object against Edward taking orders. So he becomes a priest, and he has a salary of £250 a year, which is nothing for their social class, right? Uh, but she gives them £10,000, which had been given with Fanny. So uh, something she had withheld before, now she's allowing. So they get £10,000. It was as much, however, as was desired, and more than was expected by Edward and Eleanor. And Mrs. Ferrars herself, by her shuffling excuses, seemed the only person surprised at her not giving more. With an income quite sufficient to their wants, thus secured to them, they had nothing to wait for after Edward was in possession of the living but the readiness of the house, to which Colonel Brandon, with an eager desire for the accommodation of Eleanor, was making considerable improvements, and after waiting some time for their completion, after experiencing, as usual, 1,000 disappointments and delays from the unaccountable dilatoriness of the workmen, Eleanor, as usual, broke through the first positive resolution of not marrying till everything was ready, and the ceremony took place in Barton Church early in the autumn. And that's it, they got married. The first month after their marriage was spent with their friend at the mansion house, from whence they could superintend the progress of the parsonage and direct everything as they liked on the spot, could choose papers, wallpapers, project shrubberies, and invent a sweep. So Colonel Brandon is doing more than he would have done to anyone else. So he is improving the house and adding so much more than was necessary or that was um, expected for the clergy, the reverend, the priest, um, Edward's role, um, because Colonel Brandon, really loves Eleanor and he wants to do that for her own comfort, for her happiness. Mrs. Jennings' prophecies, though rather jumbled together, were chiefly fulfilled, for she was able to visit Edward and his wife in their parsonage by Michaelmas, and she found in Eleanor and her husband, as she really believed, one of the happiest couple in the world. They had, in fact, nothing to wish for but the marriage of Colonel Brandon and Marianne, and rather better pasturage for their cows. They were visited on their first settling by almost all their relations and friends. Mrs. Ferrars came to inspect the happiness which she was almost ashamed of having authorized, and even the Dashwoods were at the expense of a journey from Sussex to do them honor. I will not say that I am disappointed, my dear sister, said John, as they were walking together one morning before the gates of Delaford House. That would be saying too much, for certainly you have been one of the most fortunate young women in the world, as it is. But I confess it would give me great pleasure to call Colonel Brandon brother. His property here, his place, his house, everything in such respectable and excellent condition. And his woods. I have not seen such timber anywhere in Dorsetshire, and there is now standing in Delaford Hanger. And though perhaps Marianne may not seem exactly the person to attract him, little did he know, yet I think it would altogether be advisable for you to have them now frequently staying with you, for as Colonel Brandon seems a great deal at home, nobody can tell what may happen, for when people are much thrown together and see little of anybody else, and it will always be in your power to set her off to advantage and so forth. In short, you may as well give her a chance. You understand me. So John wants the Colonel Brandon as his brother-in-law at all costs. So if it didn't work out with Eleanor, let's try with Marianne. He didn't even know that the Colonel actually really loved Marianne since the beginning. But though Mrs. Ferrars did come to see them and always treated them with the make-believe of decent affection, they were never insulted by her real favor and preference. That was due to the folly of Robert and the cunning of his wife, and it was earned by them before many months had passed away. The selfish sagacity of the latter, which had at first drawn Robert into the scrape, was the principal instrument of his deliverance from it. For her respectful humility, assiduous attentions, and endless flatteries, as soon as the smallest opening was given for their exercise, reconciled Mrs. Ferrars to his choice and re established him completely in her favor. Look at that, how sly Lucy is. Not only did she manage to marry Robert Ferrars, she used her skills, her flatteries, her humility, her attentions, and she, let's say, bought back with words and actions, not with money, bought back um, Mrs. Ferrars' favors. And Robert is again the favorite son. Look at that. The whole of Lucy's behavior in the affair, and the prosperity which crowned it, therefore, may be held forth as a most encouraging instance of what an earnest and unceasing attention to self interest, however its progress may be apparently obstructed, will do in securing every advantage of fortune with no other sacrifice than that of time and conscience. And this is the narrator judging Lucy's actions. When Robert first sought her acquaintance and privately visited her in Bartlett's buildings, it was only with a view imputed to him by his brother. He merely meant to persuade her to give up the engagement, and as there could be nothing to overcome but the affection of both, he naturally expected that one or two interviews would settle the matter. In that point, however, and that only, he erred. For though Lucy gave him hopes that his eloquence would convince her in time, another visit, another conversation was always wanted to produce this conviction. Some doubts always lingered in her mind when they parted, which could only be removed by another half hour's discourse with himself. His attendance was by these means secured, and the rest followed in course. See how cunning she is? Not silly after all, right? Instead of talking of Edward, they came gradually to talk only of Robert, a subject on which he had always more to say than on any other, and in which she soon betrayed an interest even equal to his own. So she was as interested in Robert as Robert was interested in Robert. See the vain, the pride, the vanity. Um, and in which she soon betrayed an interest even equal to his own. And in short, it became speedily evident to both that he had entirely supplanted his brother. He was proud of his conquest, proud of tricking Edward, and very proud of marrying privately without his mother's consent. What immediately followed is known. They passed some months in great happiness at Dawlish, for she had many relations and old acquaintances to cut. Now that she was Mrs. Ferrars, she could not be seen in such society, so she was happy to cut old acquaintances. And he drew several plans for magnificent cottages, and from thence returning to town, procured the forgiveness of Mrs. Ferrars by the simple expedient of asking it, which, at Lucy's instigation, was adopted. The forgiveness at first, indeed, as was reasonable, comprehended only Robert, and Lucy, who had owed his mother no duty, and therefore could have transgressed none, still remained some weeks longer unpardoned. But for perseverance in humility of conduct and messages, in self condemnation for Robert's offense, and gratitude for the unkindness she was treated with, procured her in time the haughty notice which overcame her by its graciousness, and led soon afterwards, by rapid degrees, to the highest state of affection and influence. Lucy became as necessary to Mrs. Ferrars as either Robert or Fanny. And while Edward was never cordially forgiven for having once intended to marry her, and Eleanor, though superior to her in fortune and birth, was spoken of as an intruder, she, Lucy, was in everything considered and always openly acknowledged to be a favorite child. So not only did Lucy manage to be forgiven, she also became a necessary member of the family and considered a child, and not only any child, a favorite child. They settled in town, received very liberal assistance from Mrs. Ferrars, were on the best terms imaginable with the Dashwoods, and setting aside the jealousies and ill will continually subsisting between Fanny and Lucy, in which their husbands, of course, took a part, as well as the frequent domestic disagreements between Robert and Lucy themselves, nothing could exceed the harmony in which they all lived together. What Edward had done to forfeit the right of eldest son might have puzzled many people to find out, and what Robert had done to succeed to it might have puzzled them still more. It was an arrangement, however, justified in its effects, if not in its cause. For nothing ever appeared in Robert's style of living or of talking to give a suspicion of his regretting the extent of his income, as either leaving his brother too little or bringing himself too much. And if Edward might be judged from the ready discharge of his duties in every particular, from an increasing attachment to his wife and his home, and from the regular cheerfulness of his spirit, he might be supposed no less contented with his lot, no less free from every wish of an exchange. So they're happy. Eleanor's marriage divided her as little from her family as could be contrived, without rendering the cottage at Barton entirely useless, for her mother and sisters spent much more than half their time with her. Mrs. Dashwood was acting on motives of policy as well as pleasure in the frequency of her visits at Delaford, for her wish of bringing Marianne and Colonel Brandon together was hardly less earnest, though rather more liberal than what John had expressed. It was now her darling object. Precious as was the company of her daughter to her, she desired nothing so much as to give up its constant enjoyment to her valued friend, and to see Marianne settled at the mansion house was equally the wish of Edward and Eleanor. They each felt his sorrows and their own obligations, and Marianne, by general consent, was to be the reward of all. With such a confederacy against her, with a knowledge so intimate of his goodness, with a conviction of his fond attachment of her, which at last, though long after it was observable to everybody else, burst on her, what could she do? And now the following paragraph is one of my favorites. This is about Marianne's journey. Let's read. Marianne Dashwood was born to an extraordinary fate. She was born to discover the falsehood of her own opinions, and to counteract by her conduct her most favorite maxims. She was born to overcome an affection formed so late in life as at 17, and with no sentiment superior to strong esteem and lively friendship, voluntarily to give her hand to another. And that other, a man who had suffered no less than herself under the event of a former attachment, whom 2 years before she had considered too old to be married, and who still sought the constitutional safeguard of a flannel waistcoat. I love this paragraph. So, Marianne, it's also funny because of the flannel thing in the at the end, but Marianne, when was born to an extraordinary fate. It's not extraordinary. We all go through that. It is part of our lives, our journey as human beings, to discover the falsehood of our own opinions and to counteract by our own conduct our most favorite maxims. Remember, she did not believe in second attachments. One could only love once, and it had to be while you're young. After you're young, no, it is not real love anymore, right? She came to realize that she was wrong, that she formed an attachment, a second attachment, that was even stronger than the first one because constant and stable and therefore comforting. Um, so late in life at 17, of course, the narrator is being sarcastic because Marianne in the beginning thought that that was already, an old age, and 35, then 36, extremely old. She came to realize that 17 is not that old, that it is possible to find love in a second attachment, that it's possible to love a man who is twice her age, and it's possible to love a man who still wears a flannel waistcoat. So she has come to realize all the wrongs in her beliefs and conducts by experiencing that herself. She had to experience that, otherwise she would not have learned. But so it was. Instead of falling a sacrifice to an irresistible passion, as once she had fondly flattered herself with expecting, Instead of remaining even forever with her mother and finding her only pleasure in retirement and study, as afterwards, in her more calm and sober judgment, she had determined on, she found herself at 19 submitting to new attachments, entering on new duties, placed in a new home, a wife, the mistress of a family, and the patroness of a village. So she went from two extremes, right? The first extreme was false sacrifice to an irresistible passion with Willoughby, to another extreme, to remaining forever with her mother and sisters and finding pleasure only in retirement and study. That was another extreme. She found the balance, that of finding herself submitting to new attachments, entering on new duties, and having a new home, a new role in inside the family and in the village. Colonel Brandon was now as happy as all those who best loved him believed he deserved to be. In Marianne, he was consoled for every past affliction. Her regard in her society restored his mind to animation and his spirits to cheerfulness. And that Marianne found her own happiness in forming his was equally the persuasion and delight of each observing friend. Marianne could never love by halves, and her whole heart became, in time, as much devoted to her husband as it had once been to Willoughby. So it was not love at first sight and uncontrollable passion as it was with Willoughby, and that cannot last, but a constant relationship. And with time, she, instead of loving just with half of her heart, she loved Colonel Brandon with all of her heart. Um, Willoughby, let's see what happened to Willoughby. Willoughby could not hear of her marriage without a pang, and his punishment was soon afterwards complete in the voluntary forgiveness of Mrs. Smith, who, by stating his marriage with a woman of character as the source of her clemency, gave him reason for believing that had he behaved with honor towards Marianne, he might at once have been happy and rich. That his repentance of misconduct, which thus brought its own punishment, was sincere, need not be doubted, nor that he long thought of Colonel Brandon with envy and of Marianne with regret. But that he was forever inconsolable, that he fled from society, or contracted an habitual gloom of temper, or died of a broken heart, must not be depended on, for he did neither. That's the narrator. He lived to exert and frequently to enjoy himself. His wife was not always out of humor, nor his home always uncomfortable, and in his breed of horses and dogs, and in sporting of every kind, he found no inconsiderable degree of domestic felicity. So, you, as a reader, can imagine that Willoughby suffered for all his life, that, what was it, that he became inconsolable, that he fled from society, or that he died of a broken heart. But that's not the case. That's not real life. He ended up perfectly happy after all. Not as happy as he could have been with Marianne, perhaps, but still. Um, he had a comfortable life. He had fun with his horses and dogs and sports, and his wife was not always annoying. So he had pretty good life. And that's real life, right? It's not a fairy tale. So Jane Austen's being very realistic here. For Marianne, however, in spite of his incivility in surviving her loss, he always retained that decided regard which interested him in everything that befell her, and made her his secret standard of perfection in woman. And many a rising beauty would be slighted by him in after days as bearing no comparison with Mrs. Brandon. Mrs. Dashwood was prudent enough to remain at the cottage without attempting a removal to Delaford. And fortunately for Sir John and Mrs. Jennings, when Marianne was taken from them, Margaret had reached an age highly suitable for dancing and not very ineligible for being supposed to have a lover. So it starts again the circle with the next generation. So now Sir John and Mrs. Jennings will tease Margaret and make fun of her love interests, and that's their form of amusement. Between Barton and Delaford, there was that constant communication which strong family affection would naturally dictate. And among the merits and the happiness of Eleanor and Marian, let it not be ranked as the least considerable that those sisters, and living almost within sight of each other, they could live without disagreement between themselves or producing coolness between their husbands. That's the end of the novel. So that's not something small. The fact that they were sisters and living very close, almost within sight of each other, they managed to live without disagreement between themselves or producing coolness between their husbands. That is the ending of Sense and Sensibility. It's not a fairy tale ending, it's quite a realistic ending. And that is um, important for Jane Austen, right? So I'm curious, what do you think? Jenny says she's sad to leave all these familiar characters behind. Yes. How nice would it be if Jane Austen had continued writing about the second generation with Margaret as a title character? That would be interesting. I'm pleased that Mr. Willoughby ended up unhappy. Yes, he ended up unhappy, although not forever. He eventually got over it because that's what happens in true life. In a novel of sensibility that Marianne thought herself as a protagonist in the beginning, remember? In novels of sensibility, people die of a broken heart. In real life, no. So, yes, he suffered, but in the end, um, he got over it. Jenny says, not as unhappy as he should have been. Yes, he should have suffered more. But the good thing is that they're all sufficiently happy at the end. They all have to um, evolve and mature and to sacrifice things um, to achieve perhaps not a complete happiness. Maybe complete happiness does not exist, but a sufficiently good enough happiness, comfortable happiness. Jenny says, always wanted Colin O'Brien and Marianne to get together. Yes, but they needed to experience, especially Marianne needed to experience the relationship with Willoughby to understand the value of a constant relationship with Colin O'Brien. Misha says, I'm going to have a book hangover after this. Jenny says, I like that it's a real life ending. Yes, and that is something that Jane Austen brings to her books, right? It's not about creating false expectations in lives of women. It's about being reasonable and, yeah, um, being truer to life than the novels of sensibility that were popular at the end of the 18th century. Michelle says, I'm so attached to the characters, I have to watch the movie now. Jenny thinks it's a good idea. I think so too. Yes, they're great characters. And I'm glad you enjoyed. So we've reached the end of our journey with Sense and Sensibility, with the Dashwood sisters, with Colin O'Brien, with Edward Ferrars, with Willoughby. They are great characters, unforgettable indeed. And I hope this was the first project of sessions of guided reading, and we started with Jane Austen's first published novel, Sense and Sensibility. I hope it goes to show that reading classics can be scary and intimidating at first, especially when we come across such big names that seem to be so distant and unreachable to normal readers, like Jane Austen, William Shakespeare, Charles Dickens. Um, but they are not distant. They wrote to be read. They wrote to connect with you, reader. It doesn't matter where you come from, what language you speak. The book connects us. So um, I hope this goes to show that reading classics is not scary if you do it well. Let's say if you really engage with the text, you take the time to appreciate it. Jenny says that she liked especially learning about the context of the book while reading it. That's really important, to read literature in context, to understand their reality of life and how that is different from ours. For example, relationships, means of transportation, ways of eating, ways of communicating. It's different. And it's important to understand that in order to experience as much as possible what the characters would have gone through. That's why reading is a sort of time machine. We go back in time to Regency England. We go back in time to to the time of course, fictional, but Marianne and Eleanor Dashwood. So, like I said in the beginning, it's about quality and not quantity. So, we've taken 3 months to read this book, and it's been a gratifying experience, I hope. So, take the time to read and appreciate literature. Don't rush from one book to the next. So think about it and let me know, what would you like to read next in a guided reading session at Books and Culture. And remember, I told you in the beginning of this session that you should stay until the end because I have a surprise for you. I have a gift. So, this is not the end of your journey with Jane Austen. I hope this is just the beginning. There is so much more to explore. And I would like to give you that opportunity to explore, dig deeper into the works of Jane Austen, her life, her context, with the course at Jane Austen Club. So if you've made it this far, if you're still here with me, watching me or listening to me, I have a surprise for you. So if you're not yet part of the course at Jane Austen Club, I would like to offer you a discount so you can get started right away. And as soon as you sign up for the course, you have access, immediate access to the lessons. I would like to give you a 15% discount, which is something very special. But I cannot do that for everyone, of course. So I'm going to give 15% to the first 10 people that sign up for the course using the code, pay attention, YT, as in YouTube, YT15. So you've made it this far. This is my secret gift to you. The discount code wide YT15 to get 15% off the Jane Austen Club and continue your Austenian journey. Jenny says that she really recommends the Jane Austen Club course. Um, and I hope you do as well. Take the chance to dig deeper and explore the the works, the fantastic work, life, career, and context in which she wrote and published her novels, also her letters, her unfinished works, her juvenilia. There's a lot to explore in the course, the Jane Austen Club. Okay, so let me know what you would like to read next. Michelle says Jane Eyre. That's a very good idea. I'll keep you posted. So this is the end of our guided reading sessions of Jane Austen Sense and Sensibility. I hope to see you in the course at Jane Austen Club, and I'll soon be back with another project of guided reading sessions. Michelle says the Jane Austen Club is truly enlightening, truly enlightening. I'm glad and I hope you hop on board this literary journey with me. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'll see you in another event at Books and Culture. Bye.